Yeah, so a lot of people talk about implementing an ISMS and often think that it's an extremely complex thing to do, but actually there are a number of key steps which will allow you to very quickly get your ISMS off the ground within a 10-day period. Then following on from that, you really need to then embed that in the organisation's culture. The first step to success really is to understand what we call the context of your organisation, and that's simply about taking some time to understand the kind of products and services you offer to your customers and understand the kind of risks in your organisation so that you can actually build your ISMS in the right part of your business and protect those processes that really do need to be controlled from a security point of view. Once you have an understanding of the internal context and those important business processes and assets and so forth, you then need to take a look at what's going on outside your organisation, what kind of legislation applies to your business from a security point of view, what sort of threats and risks do you face from the outside. So if you've got intellectual property, would your competitors be interested in that intellectual property? Would cyber criminals be interested in the kind of data you have? So you get a very good understanding, and from there you can set about writing your ISMS scope. The ISMS scope is absolutely critical. If you start with a fairly small scope, you can implement an ISMS quite quickly, and then over time your strategy could be to grow the ISMS from there. Once you've understood the scope and exactly where in your organisation you'd like to start implementing your ISMS, the next thing really is to ensure that your management fully understand your strategy and the benefits behind this, and there are a number of things we can do, and one way of showing that management commitment is putting together a clear information security policy, and in that policy that's where you're going to state what your ISMS is trying to achieve, i.e. the objectives, and indeed you should have a number of objectives that are both focused on security but also on the commercial benefits that your ISMS can bring. Clearly, once you put that policy together, as I say, this is where you need to really convince management, and often many organisations, one of the best ways to convince management here is that actually implementing proactive processes can actually, believe it or not, reduce your costs. You can reduce your costs by understanding the kind of risks you face, understanding your business processes, and often when you do, you often find many opportunities for increased efficiency savings. You can reduce the cost of potential security breaches going forward. But the biggest thing I think a lot of organisations see when they're certified to something like ISO 27001, they become recognised by their customers as actually taking cybersecurity and information security seriously. So with those messages, the next step is to get that management sign-off and approval, so everybody knows that this is driven from the top of your organisation. A bit earlier on we said that you start at the beginning by understanding the context and starting to think about some of the risks and where they might come from, risks to your information security. The next step really is to agree the process of how you're going to actually assess those risks and weigh them up and consider what your most significant risks are. And a lot of organisations get very scared of this because there are many complicated and in-depth risk assessment methods out there. But actually, if you're looking to get an ISMS off the ground quickly, there's nothing to stop you just starting with a basic methodology, just coming up with some risk scenarios. And the way I tend to do it is ask the question, well, where are the threats coming from? So who is out there who might want to compromise our information, steal our information, so forth? And what kind of techniques might they use? And there's usually a number of contenders, whether it be insider fraud risks, whether it be attacks from cyber criminal groups, whether it be competitors and so forth. You can very quickly, just through a simple brainstorming session, identify those potential sources of risk. And then it's simply a case of having some kind of scale to weigh up the likelihood of those scenarios coming true and the level of potential damage that can be done. And there are quite a number of simple, easy to understand methods out there that will at least get you started. Now in due course, obviously you can become more sophisticated and dig deeper into these risk scenarios, but for now, to get the ISMS off the ground, within the 10 days that we're talking about, this is a great place to start. Once you understand the risks that you're facing, you can then work with your colleagues in the organisation to design or come up with something called a risk treatment plan. And quite simply, a risk treatment plan is just laying out for each of those whether you feel those risks will be acceptable to the organisation, or whether you can actually take some kind of action to perhaps reduce those risks, or at least manage them to a level that both the organisation and its management are comfortable with. Once you've got your risk treatment plan together, so you've decided, well, what actions you're going to take. If you look at Annex A of ISO 27001, at first, when you're looking to do this, it can be very overwhelming. There's 114 security controls in there. But the good news is, it's not mandated that you shall simply implement each and every one of them. What you do is you take a good look at those security controls and you choose the ones that are relevant to your organisation based on the risk assessment that you did earlier. Once you've identified what those security controls are, simply what you do, and you can use a simple spreadsheet approach to do this, you can document all of this in a statement of applicability. The statement of applicability simply says which of those controls you're implementing and why, and which controls you've chosen not to implement. If you choose not to implement controls, it's very important that you can justify that and state why. And really, for me, when you're deciding which of these controls are required, it comes back to 3 or 4 different things. And those things are, is there a risk that you need to manage, in which case you'll select a control? Is there a legal requirement to implement the control? Certainly when you look at things like data protection regulations and GDPR that's coming up, this has certain requirements for controls. Is there a regulatory reason for the control? Perhaps if you're processing credit card data, you'll have demands from PCI DSS and things like this. Or is there a contractual obligation from your customers who might ask you to implement certain things, such as responding to an incident within a certain time frame? So these are some of the things that you might consider. Of course, what we do know is a lot of organisations, when you look at their security, have probably implemented many of the controls from ISO 27001 already. You might call those your baseline controls as well, so it's also worth looking at what you already have in place. Once you have took the steps, you have your controls in place, the next process that we need to design as part of getting our ISMS off the ground is the internal audit process. Simply what an internal audit process is to allow somebody else in the organisation to, or perhaps from outside the organisation, to have an independent review of your management system. Again, we can do that fairly quickly if you start with a small scope. We can then get the audit team to look at certain parts of your ISMS. What's important is those people that perform those internal audits are independent of the work being done. So in other words, they're not auditing parts of the management system that they are responsible for or are involved with, and that those individuals are competent. So how would you define whether somebody is competent to do your internal audits? Well, perhaps you could look at things like their experience, their certifications, things like ISO 27001 lead auditors certainly give an idea as to whether those auditors are competent. So once you've sourced your competent auditors, you can very quickly put together an audit program. The final step in the chain of the processes that you need to establish relate to what we call a management review. So once you've took your time to identify your risks, implement your controls, and also check whether those controls are working, and you've done your internal audit, the final step really is to then work with senior management to understand whether the ISMS is achieving what you set out for it to achieve, and then to really identify where you go from here in terms of your security strategy. I think the key thing to stress with all of those points is that these are the simple processes that you need to design to get an ISMS up and running. To get real benefit from your ISMS, it's not just about certification, it's not just about doing what you need to do to get through the audit. There is a lot of work from here to do in terms of embedding these processes, raising awareness, getting people in the organisation familiar with what their role is from a security point of view, and having a longer term strategy to achieve your objectives. But the 10 steps we've just talked about are a great way of starting the project and getting something together in your organisation.